welcome everyone. Thank you for attending today's webinar. Would you please put your name and the friends group that you represent in the chat box? And with that, I'll turn it over to Tom to talk about today's presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Cheryl, and welcome everybody. Thanks for spending a little bit of time on this December afternoon with us. I'm going to start off with some really good news. I think we all like some good news once in a while. The current continuing resolution bill that Congress is working on includes about $500 million of emergency funding for the National Wildlife Refuge System. So this is quite good news. And of course, the bill hasn't yet been signed into law by President Biden, but there is hope that that's going to happen by the end of the week. So this is great news for those refuges that were damaged by the recent storms this past year and the storms of the prior year. Many thanks to friends groups who submitted photographs and reached out to their congressional representatives to aid in this effort. So on to today. I'm Tom Worthington. I'm on the board of Corfa, and I'm also on the board of the Minnesota Valley Refuge Friends Group. End of the year is always a good time to kind of look back and look at the successes and the challenges we've had in the past and try to figure out what we can learn from the past that'll help us be more effective in the future. So our webinar planning team thought maybe for 2024, this is our final webinar. Let's take a look at Fish and Wildlife Service history. I know most of you are very familiar with your own refuge history, probably in fish hatchery history, but to get an idea of the agency history, we're going to go talk to 3 of our experts, and actually probably more than 3 when we get done with it all. We're going to be hearing from Mark Madison, who is the service historian at the National Conservation Training Center in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. Mark is a professional historian with degrees from Macalester College in St. Paul, Minnesota, and a doctorate in history of science from Harvard University. He's taught in Australia and the United States and is a Peace Corps veteran. And I've known Mark ever since he joined the service and when NCTC opened. And we're also very lucky to have a couple of folks from the DC booth, National Historic Fish Hatchery and Archives in Spearfish, South Dakota. We've got April Gregory and we've got Taylor Barr. April is the curator of the great collection at the DC booth hatchery, and Taylor is the museum technician at the hatchery. Spearfish is just a fantastic place. If any of you are ever traveling through Western South Dakota, going to see Mount Rushmore, you've got to be sure to stop and see the DC booth Historic Fish Hatchery. It's a fantastic place for families. So we're going to be hearing from those 2 locations, our archives in Shepherdstown, West Virginia, and from South Dakota. And we're going to start with Mark very briefly. Mark, you know, I spent my entire career in refuges. I worked for some 40 years in the refuge system, and I always believed that Fish and Wildlife Service history started in 1903 when Teddy Roosevelt established Pelican Island Bird Reservation. Will you tell me that I'm wrong?
Tom, I'm always happy to tell you when you're wrong. You're underselling our agency. We actually began in 1871, 153 years ago. So we've been around 3/5 of the history of this nation. And really the best place to learn about our origins is DC Booth, which has our fisheries and aquatic conservation archives. So I thought maybe we'd start there, and then we'll come back to NCTC and we can talk a little about the rest of the agency history after our origins.
That sounds good. April, take it away. And unmute. There we go.
All right. Thanks, Tom. And thank you, Mark. I'm April Gregory, and this is Taylor Barr. And I believe we're going to start with our PowerPoint, which you've graciously agreed to click through for us. So once that shows up, we can start our presentation. Perfect. So we're presenting today on the National Fish and Aquatic Conservation Archives, which serves the entire fisheries arm of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And it happens to be housed at the DC Booth Historic National Fish Hatchery, which Tom gave a very nice overview of. We're in the Black Hills of South Dakota. And if you're ever in the area, please do stop by. We get 190,000 visitors each summer, and we'd love to see you as well. Next slide.
So just a little bit about the fisheries history. So again, we started in 1871, and the problem was in the United States, we were having a rapid decline of fish across the country, and fishermen were noticing this and were alerting congressional members saying, we have this problem, and also this could be a food source for many Americans. And so Congress, an act was pushed through in 1871, and the U.S. Fish Commission was created. And you can see here we have some examples of those early fishermen, and also that congressional act going on. Next slide, please. Okay, so again, we had the U.S. Fish Commission. So the first federal hatchery was actually way out west. It was called McLeod. It was on the McLeod River. And that was in 1872, and they were really focused on salmon, so gathering their eggs, raising and stocking those across the country. And a lot of times we did it internationally. We still work internationally within the fisheries. But as time passed, in 1903, we named ourselves the U.S. Bureau of Fisheries, and then as time further went, in 1904, we merged with the Biological Survey and became the United States Fish and Wildlife Service and divided up regionally too. And DC Booth is also one of the older hatcheries. We were established in the early 1900s too as well. Next slide, please. I hope that we have good. So we have next slide is. There we go.
So today we're focused on the National Fish and Aquatic collecting. The fisheries program began sending historical fisheries artifacts to the DC Booth Historic National Fish Hatchery in Spearfish in the 1970s. By the 80s, that Congress recognized this, and they appropriated funding to build a collection management facility, which was completed in 1995. So there's a photo of it being built, and in the photo in the center lower part with the green grass out front, that's the building that Taylor and I are calling in from today. It's 10,000 square feet, and it's collection, temperature and humidity controlled, and serves to store all of our artifacts mainly from the fisheries program of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And so the collection is always growing, and we're going to be showing you a few of the fun artifacts and archival items from that. Next slide. So I mentioned we're housed on the DC Booth Historic National Fish Hatchery. That hatchery was originally called just Spearfish National Fish Hatchery. Taylor mentioned it's one of the oldest continuously operating ones in our agency. We were established in 1896 to propagate trout in the Black Hills. Trout aren't native to the Black Hills. And so they sent a scout out, and he's located this facility out of a 5-state region because it had great fresh water and it was close to the railroad system. So the railroads served a really important part in the fisheries transportation, in that they would put fish on the fish cars. They had 10 specially designed fish cars that they improved upon through the years that they used from the 1880s to the 1940s, and they'd stock fish out that way. So that's one of the reasons why they chose Spearfish. The town was close by, there was great water, and there was a railroad system. DC Booth, the facility was renamed after our first superintendent. His name was DeWitt Clinton, or DC Booth, and they renamed the facility in the 1980s when the facility became more focused on public outreach, historical preservation of the fisheries program, and raising fish as well. Once he got things going here, he actually started the fisheries program in Yellowstone. So he managed both this facility and the fisheries program in Yellowstone National Park. And our agency actually continued to manage the fisheries in Yellowstone National Park up through the 1980s. All right, next slide. All right, so as April was saying, we are active fish hatchery right now. So we raise and stock out brown and rainbow trout. We rotate those. Those are about on the grounds for about a year. So they come to us as fingerlings, which are the size of a finger. And we get them to almost a foot size, a nice size for if someone caught it, they can use it as for food source. Those are stocked on federal waters only. So we are looking at military bases nearby. One is Ellsworth, just outside of Rapid City and Box Elder. We also stock the reservations. So those go up into eastern Montana and all the reservations in South Dakota. And we receive 190,000 visitors that come through, and we found out a lot of that they come from out of town, and we have a good connection with the city of Spearfish. So we also have volunteers that help us out through the year. Our venues are open in the summer, about 9 o'clock to about dusk too. So our big help with all this visitor service outreach stuff like that is our Booth Society. They're a sister organization, and they've been around since the 80s, where originally the hatchery was in the hands of the city for a time, but then it went back to the United States Fish and Wildlife Service. So they are a huge backbone for us. And again, so our hatchery grounds are huge. So you can see on the bottom left-hand corner. So we have our gift shop that's managed by the Booth Society down on the bottom near the ponds. We have about 5 of those huge ponds on site. Those are basically trophy fish. So some of them can be up to 10 years old, and they can be massive in there. And it's for educational purposes. And then we have our raceways, which is where our baby fish are raised and taken care of. And then our museum is just across from those raceways, and we are having a major museum redesign, and we'll touch on that later a bit, but that'll be open in June of 2025. And then, of course, our cultural management facilities just up from that. That's where we house the collection. And then from up that is the booth house. It was originally for the superintendent of the site. The superintendent does not live on that site anymore, but up to about the 70s and 80s, they were on that. So it's a historic house. Next slide, Tom. All right, thanks, Taylor. So now we're going to focus on the collection. So the collection has about 14,000 artifacts, and those are mainly fisheries related. So that's anything fish culture, equipment, scientific equipment, maintenance, because maintenance is a really big part of fish hatcheries, you know, keeping everything running to keep your livestock alive so it can be stocked out successfully. Uniforms, original artwork, outreach materials, fish transportation materials, as well as several full-size stocking trucks that we have. Additionally, in the previous slide, one other thing is we have the fish car replica. So we have a 2-scale model of a fish car number 3, and our volunteers and staff in the 80s and 90s created a full-scale replica. So if you ever stop by, make sure to go through that fish rail car. We were hoping to be able to show that to you today, but it didn't work with our internet connection. But there's a lot more. One thing I want to call out on this slide to your attention related to the rail car is the car messenger badge in the upper right-hand corner. So those were really good jobs to have back in the day. They always had a staff of 5, and they had uniforms that they wore, including a badge. And our collection has 2 of the only known badges in existence from the rail car era of our agency, and that's the one that the messenger would wear. We also have a captain badge, which looks identical, except it says car captain on it. All right, next slide. So we have 2 parts to this collection. What April was talking about is what we refer to 3D, so they're objects. 2D is archival materials. We have over 2 million documents, and these can be a wide range. So a lot of times we have original logbooks. These date back to sometimes early 1900s. Really helpful. When we have research requests, sometimes they come in and they go, hey, where did we stock this trout? Sometimes we can get really nitty gritty and look into these logbooks and see exactly the locations where these were at. Blueprints, we have these plans of maintenance equipment, such as a fear no pill, which we will show you. We have those blueprints, and we have them of the facilities, sometimes the buildings on those sites.
Annual reports also, those are our big ones that come in. So if we ever need to look up something in general from an era, we can usually look in there. They'll give us their stocking numbers, stuff like that. Scientific studies all across the board. Our big one we have right now are PFCs, or called progressive fish culturalists. We have several photographs, and I mean, we have negatives, which are those black and white ones that are see-through. We also have colors, Polaroids, general black and white photos, which are again very helpful for outreach. And then we have glass plate negatives, same thing. It's kind of that see-through, but instead of photo being on like paper, it's on a thick piece of glass instead. And of course, maps of the areas too. And those are just some of the archival materials we have here. Next slide, Tom.
So in closing, before we switch over to a live view and show you some artifacts that we pulled for everybody today, we are in the middle of a huge museum exhibit redesign that our incredible friends group, the Booth Society, has largely fundraised the bulk of that money to do so. So we've been working with a professional design firm out of Portland, Oregon, and the new exhibits to show up any day now, probably in January. And so the grand opening is in June of 2025. This is a full-scale remodel. Our museum is housed in our original 1899 Hatchery building. So it is in a historic building with the original office that DC Booth was with his desk. But then the rest tells the story of the National Fish Hatchery System as a whole. So it's focused on the fish culture work of our entire nation within the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So if you're around the area, please do stop by. We're looking forward to the grand opening in June of 2025. So now we're going to switch over and show you some fun artifacts. So bear with us here.
All right, so this is the first piece we have to show you guys. So you can't really tell, but it's kind of big and it's actually extremely heavy. This is called a monkey wrench. And the main idea is this can be adjusted right here. So you can work with several different types of knobs. It's a maintenance tool, which again, we have several maintenance personnel throughout the hatchery system, and they're the backbone of how our hatcheries operate. What's interesting about this, there's an extremely faded mark up here. It was Whitman and Barnes, this monkey wrench, which actually predates from where this hatchery is from. This is from Jones Hole, which was established in the 1960s. And this is actually dates to 1906. So most likely we were thinking someone took this off site and brought it to the hatchery just to work with it. And then we acquired this in 2003. So most likely it was being used during that entire time and from before.
All right, thanks, Taylor. All right, so up next, we would be remiss to not talk about fish food diet. So this is a giant blender, industrial blender. Why do we have a blender in the collection, you might be wondering. We have a lot of meat grinders, blenders, mixers in the collection. Some of the meat grinders are massively huge and weigh over a ton. And that's because pelleted fish food, if you visited a fish hatchery recently and fed the fish, the food is similar to dog or cat food that you feed your pets at home. So you can just buy it and feed it out. It's not gross. But that wasn't readily available at fish hatcheries until the late 70s, early 80s. Prior to that, if you were the new person working at a fish hatchery, one day a week you got to spend in the ice house or the meat locker. And you were just grinding up anything of high protein. So canner horses, roadkill. Sometimes they would hang roadkill over the ponds and the raceways and just let the maggots fall off into the water to feed the fish. And different species had different recipes that they used. So talking to retired fisheries biologists that we get visiting and give tours of, a lot of times they have those recipes memorized. So they might mix in rice or alfalfa or barley. But luckily, we don't usually do that anymore. We just have pelleted fish food that we can order. However, some of our threatened and endangered species that are more sensitive, some of our hatcheries currently do make their own fish food. So they might be using blenders, but probably not as old as this one. So up next, once you grow out the fish, it's very important to get them transported to their destination alive, because we've already spent so much time and effort raising them. So early on, they used milk cans because milk cans, in the 1870s through the turn of the century were readily available. In the 1920s, one of our biologists by the name of Edgar Fierno invented what became named after him, which was called the Fierno pail. Everybody switched to these. The secret was this lid. It has holes in it. So you would fill the container with your water and your fish, and then you'd put ice. You put the lid on and fill it with ice, and the ice served two purposes. As it melted and dripped into the can, the dripping would create oxygen in the water to keep the fish alive, but it would also keep it cold, also keep the water cold to keep them alive. And these, they could stack on top of each other. They used these on the trains. So as you can see, this says Natchitoches from our Natchitoches, Louisiana facility, which is still in operation today, one of our national fish hatcheries. They'd put these on the trains. The train staff would disperse them out. Then they would return the empty pails back to their stations. So they all also have an individual government property number on them as well. Up next, we pulled a few egg tongs for you to see. This is the oldest one here. It's hand carved from Leadville, Colorado. And then here's a more modern metal one. This one over here is brass. And so when you're raising eggs and the eggs are eyeing up and developing, some of them can become sick and die when you're dealing with millions of fish or salmon or warm water species. And so you have to go in by hand and pick out the dead ones because otherwise they might potentially spread fungus or disease to your healthy fish. So this was done by hand. Today we have machines that can do this largely. However, again, with some of our more sensitive species, we still do it by hand, either with tongs or a turkey siphon. So I have spent many an hour doing that back in the day as a fisheries technician. This here is one of my personal favorite pieces. It is a huge hand-thrown clay jar. And a lot of times people think with the handles that it was used for transporting fish. However, it would lay on its side on the bottom of earthen ponds for catfish. This is a clay catfish jar for spawning. So it is mimicking the cavities that they would naturally spawn in. And as the fish go in, they lay their eggs, and then the eggs develop in this at the bottom of the earthen ponds. So this is from another one of our fish hatcheries, which is still in operation in Inks Dam National Fish Hatchery down in southern Texas. They did some research. They helped me research this and found out that Marshall Pottery made these in the 1913. They actually used these up through the early 2000s. And nowadays they just use plastic garbage cans.
Thank you, April. All right. So we're going to switch over. So this piece right here is what I'm going to highlight. So this is actually, some of you may know the name of Bob Hines. So this is one of his original artwork pieces. This is an Arctic grayling. So an interesting thing about this piece is actually Bob had never seen an Arctic grayling before this. So this is kind of just what he was told, and he drew this up. He later went on a expedition to Alaska a few years later after that, and he worked on a book and drew a ton of wildlife from up in Alaska. And so Bob, again, is our huge U.S. fish wildlife artist. He worked with Rachel Carson a lot of the times too, and he also helped out with that duck stamp. So then down here, April was mentioning earlier the fish rail cars. So these are original Chinaware from those cars. Again, like she was saying, those would have been pulled all across the country, those rail cars. A lot of the times they were attached back to the on the back of trains, and they would get either a really good deal for doing that or not even get charged at all for doing that, just because the rail system was really appreciative of stocking out fish during that time. And so again, there's 5 about on the these rail cars. You had the cook, you had the captain, who's like your lead fish biologist, and then you had what were the messengers, your biologists. And again, uniforms, and they had their own dishware. So these are from that era. These are original pieces. You can see on here, we have the little USBF flag, United States Bureau of Fisheries. And we just have this cup, saucer, plate, bigger saucepans. And again, they were definitely deserve this. They worked very hard, and they actually had more dishware than I think I have right now. So,
and they were made in Buffalo, New York.
Yep. So back to Bob again. So this is also one of other Bob's pieces. We have, this is the Yellowstone cutthroat trout. On our grounds, we used to raise these. We don't do it anymore. We do rainbow and brown trout right now. But again, you can see this poor little fish. He's in for it. He's probably going to catch that line and be killed. But again, food source. So along those lines, so around COVID, staff at the hatchery and also working with Craig Springer worked hard to make this book. This is a celebration of the 150th time of federal fish hatcheries. So this book goes through the different hatcheries, people who worked on the hatcheries, and a celebration of that branch. And again, this is also just an example of using our archives. So for this book, almost everything in this came from this collection and this archives. And we have several research requests come in every year. A lot of them are internally within the fisheries branch, but we also have some external research requests come in too. So, and with this book, you guys can purchase this at Barnes & Noble too as well.
All right. And that is it from our end at the National
All right.
Fish and Aquatic Conservation Archive.
Thank you so much, Taylor. April, wonderful to see you and the great collection. And everyone, if you're traveling in South Dakota, you've got to get here. Mark, I think we're going to switch it to you in Shepherdstown, West Virginia.
All right, welcome back to West Virginia. That was a great introduction to our history from DC Booth, our sister archive. We're great to see you. We're going to talk about some of the non-fisheries history in the last 153 years. And we'll start with this very large firearm. It's called a punt gun. These were commonly used in the 1880s and 1890s in the Chesapeake Bay, among other places. And that's one of the reasons the sister agency to the Bureau of Fisheries, the Bureau of Biological Survey, was created. The decimation of waterfowl, game species, game mammals, and so on led in 1885 to the creation of the Bureau of Biological Survey. And that was in charge of everything that wasn't a fish, basically, everything that didn't live in the water. And we had these two sister agencies, the Biological Survey and the Bureau of Fisheries, that coexisted until 1939, when they were both moved to the Department of Interior. In 1940, they were renamed the Fish and Wildlife Service, which is why we have a redundant name, right? Fish is a type of wildlife. If you're curious what our leadership looked like in the Biological Survey, this is a nice little photo from 1891 of our leadership in Death Valley. So they were real field naturalists. They kind of look like extras from Gunsmoke or Yellowstone. And they were out there doing a natural history survey in Death Valley. Got a couple other things from the 1880s, the early years of the Biological Survey. I'll bring you over here to one of our cabinets. One of the fun things about archives is, I think you got a sense of that, well, two things. One, we like to do a lot of show and tell, and also we get things in that aren't immediately recognizable, like the fish card china you saw. This is one of my favorite objects. It's one of the sturdier ones we have. It's a branding iron with the unfortunate acronym USBS carved into it. We did not have as good an acronym as the U.S. Bureau of Fisheries. We were the Biological Survey. And then the question is, what were we branding? We obviously didn't brand wildlife. Our early refuge managers were given horses. They were branded with this occasionally. We used them as property markers to mark out early refuges. And we even used them, you can see here in this very fancy toolkit, as a property marker. So we had USBS over everything until we became the Fish and Wildlife Service. A lot of you I know are friends at wildlife refuges. And we have some things from the very origins of the wildlife refuge system. It began in 1903. Was started by President Theodore Roosevelt. The first wildlife refuge was Pelican Island in Florida, which was about 4 1/3 acres, very small. And from that era, we have some items from the very first refuge employee. In fact, the only refuge employee from 1903 to 1904, a gentleman named Paul Craigle, was an Audubon warden who was hired to manage the refuge. We have his sidearm, his pipe, which was not government issue, and his badge. And he was charmingly called a bird warden. That was his official position. And he was paid a salary of $1 a month, basically. He was basically a volunteer. In addition to that, if we're going to go over here for a sec, we have the executive order setting up Pelican Island from Theodore Roosevelt. This is from March 14th, 1903. So this is where Tom traces our history, and it's an important history. Theodore Roosevelt, he was an avid birder. He was an avid naturalist and sportsman. Started the first wildlife refuge. It was called a bird reservation at the time, and nothing like it existed in the world prior to that, really. Subsequently, we've grown from 4 1/3 acres to more than 570 refuges, managing over 100 million terrestrial acres and another 750 million marine acres. So in all likelihood, we will be stewarding 1 billion acres over the next generation or so, which is quite an achievement. The refuge system got a good start under Theodore Roosevelt, but then it grew a lot under this gentleman, Ding Darling, which is also the name of a refuge we have on Sanibel Island. Ding Darling came to the agency in the 1930s. It was a time of the Depression and Dust Bowl, and he really transformed the agency. This is Ding Darling's artist desk, and Ding was an editorial cartoonist, kind of an odd choice to run the biological survey, but it turned out to be a very good director, actually a transformative director. Darling, when he came to head the biological survey, had an idea to transform the Fish and Wildlife Service, and he did it in a couple different ways. First, he took his artist's ability and designed the very first sign for the for the National Wildlife Refuge System. This is what became the Blue Goose. It initially was black, and this is the very first sign he designed in 1934. Until 1934, the refuge system didn't have an identity, even though the Park Service and other federal lands agencies did. And as a communications expert who was an editorial cartoonist for the Des Moines Register, he knew it was important we be able to identify when people were on refuges as opposed to, say, national parks or national forests. Darling also came up with another pretty good design that had huge implications for many of your refuges, and that was the duck stamp. So in 1934, he came up with the idea to sell duck stamps for $1 to sportsmen who wanted to hunt waterfowl. And Darling not only came up with the idea, pushed it through Congress, but he actually drew the very first duck stamp, pictured here. And in the first year it existed, it raised $600,000. And this is really important to the refuge system in that prior to that, we didn't have regularly appropriated funds to purchase habitat. Now a large number of our refuges are actually purchased with duck stamp monies. And in fact, this year we celebrated the 90th anniversary of the duck stamp. We have another thing of Darling's. This is the original etching he used on his printing press, which is in the museum. It's a little too big for us to bring over here, like that. And this would have been what he would have used to print off the engravings right here. So Darling transformed the refuge system. From 1903 to 1934, they basically functioned as kind of independent oases for birds or for elk or for bison and so on. After 1934, as you can see from his sign, he tried to create migratory bird flyways. He tried to connect up the refuge system where the sum was greater than the parts. Really, he made the refuge system systematic. It was a system after that and really transformed our agency. If you want to trace back the history of the modern National Wildlife Refuge System, it owes more to 1934 and Ding Darling probably than the original bird reservation. Now, I do not work down here solo. We have a dedicated archive staff out here at the NCTC archives in Shepherdstown, and I'm going to have some of them explain some of the other interesting artifacts we have here. First person I'm going to turn it over to is Jamie Stoner. She is our museum tech, and she's going to tell you about our most famous refuge employee, Rachel Carson.
Thanks, Mark. I'm going to talk to you about Rachel Carson. She is possibly our most
Mark, we're losing your audio a little bit. Try that microphone again. No. No, sorry. Not working. Oh, shoot.
No.
And just a reminder to people as we're working through this audio issue, if you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat box and we'll get answers at the end of the show here.
Does this one work?
Yes, ma'am.
Lower? Perfect. Okay. So I'm not quite sure where it was. Rachel Carson was our first employee, aquatic biologist. Well, female employee, sorry. And she eventually moved up to chief editor. And while with the service, she would publish pamphlets of conservation in action. She was also very passionate about the sea, and a lot of her works that she published privately were about the sea. But her most famous publication was Silent Spring on the harmful effects of DDT. And it was the call to the modern environmental movement to be concerned about pesticides and what we were doing in the environment. We also have her personal library. So if you're interested in Carson as a human, I can open this up. We have amazing books from her childhood, like her copy of Treasure Island, all the way to Agatha Christie. And I believe we do have a book on how to live with cats in this collection.
Jamie, you might want to mention she actually published a lot of Refuge brochures. So we had the most famous natural history writer in the world doing brochures for various refuges. This is one of the older ones from like 1946 at Chincoteague National Wildlife Refuge. And Jamie, if you open that up to the first page, the second page, the first page with writing on it.
Kind of hard in these gloves.
She has a lovely introduction to the National Wildlife Refuge System. Each of these, so this is 1946, a long time ago, has a little prologue called The Sign of the Flying Goose. And it describes why we should protect our public lands. And I think it's actually the most eloquent mission ever written for the Fish and Wildlife Service. I'm going to hold it and let Jamie read the bottom paragraph on this because it's so good.
Which side? Okay. Wild creatures, like men, must have a place to live. As a civilization creates cities, builds highways, and drains marshes, it takes away, little by little, the land that is suitable for wildlife. And as their space for living dwindles, the wildlife populations themselves decline. Refuges resist this trend by saving some areas from enrichment and by preserving in them or restoring where necessary the conditions that wild things need in order to live.
That's great. And it's a good description of why we do what we do, why your friends groups all do what they do to protect our lands. And it's really special that we had the best nature writer of the 20th century writing refuge brochures. Now we're going to turn it over to Alexandra Henry. Alex actually runs our oral history program, probably the most important part of our history work. It's managed by the Retirees Association. We have a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Retirees Association. We also have a National History Committee that April's on, and some of those viewing, like Tom and Libby, are also on that committee. And she's in charge of that. And she's going to talk a little about the oral history program and then the Endangered Species Act.
Hello, we're trying the microphone again. Let me know if you can hear me okay. Is this working or do we need the other mic?
That works.
Awesome, cool. All right, so as Mark said, I work here at NCTC with the oral history program. It's a fantastic program. A lot of it is made up from retirees who tell their story about their time in the service and just share very cool stories and future anecdotes for the next generation of Fish and Wildlife Service employees. We have a couple hundred in our collection. They're being uploaded to be able to read them publicly on our website at fws.gov. Okay, yes. So you're able to search up names, dates, stuff like that, different categories. So like law enforcement employees, ecological services, refuge employees, and so on and so forth. It's a wonderful collection, like I was saying, and it's a great tool for anyone, researchers, people who are curious about the service, and so on and so forth. So now to talk about the Endangered Species Act, which we just recently celebrated our 50th anniversary of that, I believe last December. So now we're on the 51st year. But we have a couple artifacts here in our archives, and I can open this up here. So some of the interesting things here is we actually have a condor puppet head. And this was actually used, I believe, in San Diego at the zoo to help rehabilitate and raise young condors. The idea of using the puppet head to feed the baby condors was so that they wouldn't get attached to humans, and that way when they were released to the wild, they were able to go out and hunt on their own and be able to survive without human intervention. Another fun thing we have here are these fun little 7-Eleven Slurpee cups. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with the Slurpee cups, much smaller nowadays, or back then than they are nowadays. It's no big gulp. But I believe during the 70s, they had a program running where you could buy these collectible cups. And each cup featured a different endangered species. So this one was the Florida manatee, the California condor, as I just mentioned, and some other species from around the country. The cool thing about these collector cups is that 7-Eleven partnered with Fish and Wildlife to help raise money to open up a refuge or a refuge itself. So I believe 1 penny from every cup bought went towards that, and they actually did make enough money to open the Eagle Refuge. So it was successful. Some other things we have here are the condor tags. Again, condors were a very large part of our endangered species program and stuff like that. So tracking them, making sure they were doing all right was very important. Back to oral history, we also have some oral histories about endangered species and employees who worked with the Endangered Species Act, as well as CITES. One that comes to mind right now that Mark is currently working on is with Marshall Jones, who was very integral part of the Endangered Species Act and CITES. So that will be soon prepared to be able to view online. Is there anything else, Mark?
No, I think that's it.
All right.
Now we'll turn over to Andy White, who is our historic image and film librarian, and he'll talk briefly about that collection out here at NCTC.
Hello, I'm Andy White, and as Mark was indicating, I manage the historic image and photo collection that we have here at NCTC. We have a collection of nearly 50,000 images, and gets used in a wide variety of ways, whether it be internally or externally, for research projects, for publications, for our exhibits here. Some of the images you've already seen that that Mark shown, like such as the Death Valley expedition. And we also have, and I also manage the film and video collection, of which there's an example here on the monitor that they're queuing up. And we have nearly 5,000 films and videos from the service's history. And such ones here of fishing, and I'm not sure we'll get to the one of where they're parachuting beavers into an area. We're working on gradually adding the photos online. I forgot the address for it, but yeah, conservation history. So if there's anything else, Mark?
It's just a nice little film of me fly fishing out in spearfish that Andy nicely shared. And then we're going to pass it on to our curator at the Fish and Wildlife Service Museum and Archives, Steve Fleury, who is April Gregory's counterpart out here.
Hello. Yes, as Mark mentioned, I'm the curator here at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Museum and Archives. And we've got a wonderful collection. You've seen just a few of the items in our museum collection. Interestingly, just to add to what Alex said earlier about the Endangered Species Act, so we've got some artifacts from the history of the ESA, but then about a year and a half or so ago, we actually acquired the California Condor project files. So we have the archives of the rehabilitation, the restoration of the California condor. They came from our office in Ventura, California, that handles the program. And so those are some of the other things that we're looking to acquire for the museum collection here are our scientific reports and surveys and maps. We've got a wonderful collection of artifacts that help to show our history as an agency. But we really want to acquire additional scientific project data, things that can be used to for scientists to be able to see what the past relationships to regions are to today with climate change, with changes in species of plants and animals. So we've got a wonderful collection here. And as Andy mentioned, he's actually working right now on pulling files from our archives for a book project with one of our partners, Ducks Unlimited of Canada, and the family of one of our conservation pioneers who worked for our agency back about 50 some odd years ago. So those are some of the ways that we connect with the public, as well as our service staff, our volunteers, such as you all, our friends. And just wanted to show a couple more items in the collection that we've acquired over the last several years. One of the things we've been working on is a rehabilitation of our main museum here on campus. We have, for those of you that have been here before, we have exhibits throughout the campus. And we're hoping to have some exterior wayside exhibits out on the land in coming years. But one of the things that we worked with when we were doing the renovation is expanding the interpretive message. I think we have always done an excellent job preaching to the choir. Being able to relate the history of our agency to our agency staff, but we do have a lot of other people, organizations, non-governmental organizations, other government agencies, foundations, other groups that come out here to NCTC to enjoy our wonderful campus as a place for meetings or trainings or retreats. So we want to have something in our exhibits that can appeal to everybody and hopefully encourage folks who may not be quite as maybe quite as invested in preservation of our natural heritage as our service staff are. We want to invite everybody to come onto the team and help preserve our natural heritage and follow in the footsteps of Teddy Roosevelt and Rachel Carson and all of the other great pioneers. So with that, we've been really trying over the last several years hard to work with our Indigenous partners. We've got several initiatives, both at the Department of the Interior level, across the whole government, and then with our agency. A lot of this has been spearheaded by our secretary, Secretary Holland, and I think we've made some really good repaired some bridges with folks out in Indian country. And one of the things that we've expanded our interpretive program here is working with our tribal partners to talk about what are the ways that Native cultures have always helped to conserve nature. What are they doing today, and what can modern science learn, and what can we as resource managers and protectors learn working as we work with our tribal partners. And so we took, for those of you that may have been here years ago, our original exhibit featured this wonderful collection from the Blackfeet Reservation from two artists, using the bison as kind of our creation story, I guess. The fact that the bison almost went extinct, and it was a groundswell of public support for protecting the bison that Teddy Roosevelt was heavily involved in, and as were others that helped to turn that around and bring back the bison. But there's basically all of the indigenous nations across North America have been involved in conservation since time immemorial. So rather than just focus on tribal cultures on the Great Plains, we work with artists from around the country to let the artist develop artwork that speaks to their heart, that is evocative of their culture and their resource management and subsistence needs and their culture. And so one of the things, and this ties in with the Endangered Species Act, one of the items that recently came into our collection over the last couple of years is this wonderful illustration that was done by one of our artist friends up in South Dakota. Dustin Twiss did this amazing illustration. It's actually pen and ink and colored pencil, and it's called Badlands Ferret Family. And so we've got several pieces of art that celebrate the rehabilitation of species that were close to being extinct. And what's really neat about Dustin and his story, he's Lakota. He lives on the reservation on one of the reservations of Pine Ridge, and he actually has a personal story to tell about the ferrets, because he said that, and he's a young man, but when his father was younger, his father remembers when there were very few, if any, ferrets left. And of course, his grandparents remembered them. And so in the space of 2 generations, the ferrets have come back. And that's another thing too, that the service is working with several tribes throughout the West to bring back the ferret onto tribal lands. So these are just some of the things that we have in the collection that talk about our history, but also illustrate our important partnerships with our friends and neighbors across the country, and our shared mission to conserve what we have for future generations. So with that, I'll hand it back over to. Oh, okay.
So now that you've had a chance to meet our professional staff at DC booth and NCTC, we'd be happy to take any questions you might have. We've shown you a lot of stuff. We're obviously very passionate about our history, excited about our objects. So if you all have any questions, we'll answer them either here or with our DC booth friends.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much, team out there at NCTC. Good to see you all. A couple of questions have come in the chat box, and I'll just start at the very top. Rachel wants to know how to find copies of the annual Refuge narrative reports that are in digital format. Is there one place to look?
That's a good question. The question was how to find our Refuge narrative reports. So there's a couple places. Probably the easiest place is through the Fish and Wildlife Service Library. So Steve and I and the rest of the staff you met, we all work with the Fish and Wildlife Service Library at NCTC. And a lot of those Refuge narratives have been digitized and put online through ServCat. So if you reach out to our librarian, Megan Birdie, or you can reach out to Steve or I, and you have a specific research need on Refuge narratives, we probably can find it for you. We have some copies in the archives, but the majority of them are in the process or have been digitized and put in the library system.
So what we will do is at some point we'll do a follow-up email, and we'll include some links to these resources that you mentioned.
Great.
We have a question. Is there a collection anywhere, a reproduction of those Rachel Carson brochures that are available? How can somebody get a copy of those collections?
Yeah, we digitized all the Rachel Carson brochures that we were showing you, the Refuge brochures. And if people are interested, we've actually put them on a handy dandy little USB. So you can reach out to me at mark_Madison@fws.gov, and we would be happy to mail you one. And then you can read all of Rachel Carson's prose, not just the prologue that Jamie read so well.
Nice. How can somebody visit your archives?
I'm going to turn that one over to Steve. They asked, because Steve's been working on this both for researchers and for visitors. They're asking how people can visit our archives. And then we'll turn over to April for DC Booth.
Yeah, well, we're actually working on our website right now, which will actually have, you could go onto our website once it's updated, and make an appointment. Right now, if you contact either Mark or me, and my email is Steve, the little underscore space mark, FLORAY @fws.gov. Just send Mark or me an email, and we'll work with you to try and find a time where where you can come and visit. And if you want to do some research with certain materials, we oftentimes can actually pull materials. Like I said, what Andy's working on right now is he's scanning a bunch of historic artifacts for this team up in Canada. So sometimes we can actually, do that work in-house for you. But then again, if you want to come visit us, we'd be happy to host you as well. So just reach out to us. And then once we have our website up to date, we will make sure that everyone has that address. We have a SharePoint site right now that's internal that we're planning to move all of our copy and move that information onto our external website, but it's still a work in progress. And so stay tuned.
Very good.
You might want to comment on how to visit their archives.
Yeah, so our archives are similar to the NCTC archives. You can set up an appointment ahead of time with myself, and I just dropped my email in the chat. And a lot of outdoor interpretive signs, and our grounds are open to the public 365 days out of the year from dawn to dusk. And our museum, our fisheries rail car, and our historic superintendent's house are open May through September for tours that are given by our amazing traveling RV volunteers. So, and that's free to visit anytime May through September. But if you want to see the archives, just shoot me an email and we can get a time set up. Thanks, Mark.
It's just that easy. Quick question, Mark. What's the story about the tiger in the background? Somebody wants to.
All right. Well, everybody wants to see the tiger. The tiger is a confiscation from our law enforcement division. So our law enforcement division began way back in 1900 with the Lacey Act. Today we have special agents who go out and try to capture poachers. This was somebody who illegally took a zoo tiger who died and had it stuffed and put in their living room fighting a lion, which does not happen in nature. They're found on different continents. They don't fight each other, but this was confiscated. So we have a few items up here that are confiscated. You might have seen behind me earlier a narwhal tusk, a tiger, and some of this, just to reference our 124-year-old law enforcement work.
Couple of practical questions here. Can friends groups get access to that photographic collection that you have?
Yes, they can. We can put the contact for Andy White, who's our image librarian. If friends groups need images, they can just send Andy a quick email and he can look for them. We also have a significant amount of images up on the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service National Digital Library. So we have a bunch of historic images, and all the contemporary images are up there.
Are you aware of any funding or grants that are available to help individual refuges or hatcheries do proper archiving of their own historical materials?
That I'm going to turn over to Steve. The question was, do we know of any funding or grants to help friends groups archive the materials on their particular refuges?
Or hatcheries, yeah.
Maybe Eugene Marino would be the person that might know that. Okay.
Possibly. Eugene Marino is the service's historic preservation officer. And sometimes he has funding that he can make available to stations or the regions to support historic preservation efforts. So let me give you his information. Is Eugene, EUGENE, the little underscore space mark, MARINO at FWS.gov. Eugene is an amazing guy. He actually sits out here at least one day a week. We've got a little office for him, and we actually benefit more than he does because we always bug him with questions and ask him for assistance. But I know in the past he has sometimes had funding available. You know, as a friends group, you can also, obviously, as you know, you can go out to different foundations to you know, solicit funding, grant funding and whatnot. I know that some of the refuges in the local area here have gotten funding, or the refuge friends groups have gotten funding, like from I think the Maryland Humanities Department, and probably from Virginia as well. So, and then of course, you know, if you do have a big corporation nearby, hopefully they have a foundation that makes money available to local endeavors in the history realm. You might be able to also partner with another, you know, maybe there's a small museum near you that you could pull some resources, because a lot of times, you know, what that history that's on our refuge, it's also that local history too. So you may be able to work together with your local museum, your local historical society, maybe if you have groups like the Daughters of the American Revolution nearby, or you know, some of these other groups that would be interested in that those type of efforts. You also might have, if you have a college or university nearby, you might be able to work with, you know, with the history department there. We're truly blessed here at NCTC in that we have a university just down the road, Shepherd University, and we have a lot of our interns coming from Shepherd University. And of course, Mark and several other folks teach there on occasion. So, you know, you might have some of those other opportunities as well. So definitely, you know, explore the potential partnerships that are in your area.
All right, well, great. I think that there may be a couple of other notes I'm going to pass on. Ken Graneman is an avid collector of historical materials and a creator of refuge system history. He's generously posted his access information in the chat box. So if anyone wants access to some of the materials Ken has gathered, those are available there. One person asked about a Chandler Robbins biography, and I know we've done an oral history of Chandler Robbins that has been transcribed and is now available online. And then one last question. Is there a good source? Does NCTC have a source of individual refuge history? And I'm not sure if that's what can you say about someone looking for an individual refuge history?
They should reach out to me. We have individual refuge histories for some refuges, but not all of them.
Yep.
We have materials on a lot of refuges, but once again, not all 570. So if you have a particular interest, zip me an email and we'll see what we have on that.
Well, Uh, ladies and gentlemen, that's an hour plus. This has been fantastic. I want to thank Mark and the whole team out at NCTC for spending an afternoon with us. April and Taylor out in South Dakota. It was great to see you out there. The next webinar will be in January in 2025, and the topic of that will be how friends groups can work effectively with Indigenous peoples to get projects done on the Refuge or Hatchery. The date on that to be determined. But with that, I want to give everyone our thanks for being so willing to spend your time, if you're a Friends member, if you're service staff, working to make our refuge and hatchery systems better and more vibrant places. We hope everyone has a wonderful holiday with friends and family. If you're traveling, be safe, stay warm. And with that, we'll sign off from Corfa. Thank you so much, Mark. Happy holidays, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Happy holidays.